The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of St. James's Palace as William paced his private study, his jaw clenched tight with barely contained anger. The newspaper lay crumpled on his desk, its headlines screaming accusations about Catherine that made his blood boil. For months, certain members of the aristocratic circle had whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether the woman he loved was worthy of joining the royal family. Catherine Middleton sat quietly in the adjoining room, her hands folded in her lap, trying to maintain the composure that had become her shield against the relentless scrutiny. She could hear William's footsteps, heavy and deliberate, knowing that today's charity board meeting would be different. Today, those who had tormented her with their snobbish remarks and cutting glances would face the full force of William's protection. The relationship between William and Catherine had blossomed slowly over their university years, growing from friendship into a love that surprised them both with its depth. Catherine, with her middle-class background and parents who had built their own business, represented everything that certain old-guard aristocrats feared. She wasn't born into nobility, hadn't attended the right finishing schools, and her mother had once been a flight attendant. To William, these facts only made Catherine more admirable, but to others, they were unforgivable sins. Lady Margaret Thornbury had been particularly vicious in her campaign against Catherine. As a distant cousin of the royal family and a prominent member of several charitable boards, she wielded her influence like a weapon. Her afternoon teas had become strategy sessions where she and her allies plotted ways to undermine Catherine's position, spreading rumors and making cutting remarks whenever the young woman attended official functions. William had watched Catherine endure it all with grace that both amazed and pained him. She never complained, never showed how deeply the barbs cut, but he saw the toll it took. He noticed how she would fall silent during car rides home from events, how her smile would fade the moment she thought no one was looking. He had tried to shield her, but Catherine had insisted on facing the challenges head-on, determined to prove herself worthy through her actions rather than her birthright. But last night had been the final straw. At a private dinner hosted by one of the palace's most prestigious charities, Lady Thornbury had orchestrated a particularly cruel ambush. She had seated Catherine next to Lord Pemberton, a notorious gossip who spent the entire meal making snide comments about commoners who don't know their place. When Catherine had tried to contribute to a discussion about the charity's education initiatives, drawing on her own experience with underprivileged children, Lady Thornbury had interrupted with a condescending laugh. "How charming," she had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "But perhaps we should hear from someone with actual experience in our circles. After all, charity work at this level requires a certain understanding of tradition and propriety that can't simply be learned." The room had fallen silent, all eyes turning to Catherine. William had been seated at the other end of the table, engaged in conversation with the charity's patron, but he had seen the moment unfold. He watched as Catherine's cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment but with controlled anger. She had responded with quiet dignity, outlining her detailed proposal for expanding the charity's reach. But the damage had been done. The message was clear. She would never be accepted by these people. After the dinner, William had found Catherine in the palace gardens, standing alone beneath the ancient oak trees. She hadn't been crying, but the pain in her eyes had been worse than tears. "Maybe they're right," she had whispered. "Maybe I don't belong here." Those words had ignited something fierce and protective in William. He had pulled her close, feeling her tremble against him, and made a decision. No more. He would no longer stand by while the woman he loved was subjected to such treatment. The days of polite tolerance were over. Now, as the clock chimed 9, William straightened his tie and checked his watch. The quarterly board meeting for the Royal Foundation would begin in an hour. Lady Thornbury would be there, along with Lord Pemberton and several others who had made Catherine's life miserable. They expected another routine meeting, another opportunity to subtly undermine and exclude. They had no idea what was coming. Catherine appeared in the doorway, dressed impeccably in a navy blue suit that emphasized her natural elegance. Despite everything, she held her head high, ready to face another day of subtle warfare. William crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You don't have to come today," he said softly. "I can handle the meeting alone." She shook her head, a determined glint in her eye. "I won't hide. That's what they want." William studied her face, seeing both the strength and the weariness there. "Then we go together. But Catherine, I need you to trust me. Today will be different." She searched his eyes, seeing something there that made her breath catch. "William, what are you planning?" "Justice," he replied simply. "And perhaps a reminder of what truly matters in this family." As they prepared to leave for the meeting, William's phone buzzed with a message from his private secretary. Everything was in place. The documentation he had requested had been prepared. The allies he had quietly rallied were ready, and most importantly, his grandmother had given her tacit approval for what he was about to do. The walk to the meeting room felt like a march to battle. Staff members they passed seemed to sense the tension, stepping aside with curious glances. William's protection officers exchanged knowing looks. They had seen their principal angry before, but this controlled fury was something different. Outside the boardroom, the usual pre-meeting chatter could be heard. Lady Thornberry's distinctive laugh rang out, no doubt in the middle of another cutting anecdote. William paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and looked at Catherine one more time. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "remember that you are worth 1,000 of them. And everyone who matters knows it." Catherine squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his conviction. Together they entered the room, not knowing that the next hour would become legendary in royal circles, as the day Prince William reminded everyone exactly what kind of king he would one day be, and what kind of queen would stand beside him. The boardroom fell silent as they entered. The usual greetings stilted and formal. Lady Thornberry barely glanced at Catherine, already turning to whisper something to Lord Pemberton. Other board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the electric tension that William brought with him. As they took their seats, William noticed how the seating arrangement had once again been manipulated to isolate Catherine, placing her between two empty chairs while the others clustered together. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet. Let them think they were in control for a few more minutes. The meeting began with the usual formalities. The minutes from the last meeting approved with barely a glance. Lady Thornberry, as chair of the Social Committee, launched into her report with obvious relish, outlining upcoming events and making pointed comments about maintaining appropriate standards and preserving the dignity of our institutional traditions. William listened in silence, his fingers drumming slowly on the table. Beside him, Catherine sat perfectly still, her face a mask of polite attention. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were clasped a little too tightly in her lap. Finally, Lady Thornberry concluded her report with a proposal that was clearly designed as a final insult. "I suggest that for the upcoming gala, we implement a new vetting process for all attendees. We must ensure that everyone present understands the expectations and protocols that have governed these events for generations. Perhaps a committee to review backgrounds and provide guidance to those who might be unfamiliar with our ways." Several board members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the thinly veiled attack. Lord Pemberton quickly seconded the motion, a smirk playing at his lips. That was when William stood. The scraping of William's chair against the floor cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned toward him as he rose to his full height. his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that made even the most seasoned board members shrink back. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as William's gaze swept across the assembled faces, lingering longest on Lady Thornberry. "Before we proceed with any votes," William began, his voice deadly calm, "I have some matters to address, matters that have been allowed to fester for far too long in these hallowed halls." Lady Thornberry's face paled slightly, but she attempted to maintain her authority. "Your Highness, this is highly irregular. We have procedures." "Procedures," William repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Yes, let's talk about procedures. Let's talk about the procedures that have allowed certain members of this board to conduct a systematic campaign of harassment against Catherine. Let's discuss the procedures that have enabled whispered conversations in corridors, planted stories in gossip columns, and deliberate social exclusion at every turn." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Lord Pemberton blustered, "Your Highness, I must protest. These are serious accusations without any foundation." William's hand slammed down on the table with such force that water glasses jumped. "Without foundation, I have here." He pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase. "Documented evidence of every slight, every deliberately cruel remark, every orchestrated humiliation that Catherine has endured since she entered my life. Shall I read some of them aloud?" Without waiting for an answer, William opened the folder. "March 15th, charity luncheon. Lady Thornberry tells a table of donors that some people simply can't overcome their breeding, no matter how much they try to dress it up." This was said while looking directly at Catherine. He flipped a page. "April 22nd, Lord Pemberton emails 6 board members suggesting they protect the integrity of the institution from social climbers." Catherine reached for William's arm, trying to calm him, but he was beyond stopping now. Years of suppressed anger poured out in a controlled but devastating flood. "May 3rd, he continued relentlessly, a coordinated effort to exclude Catherine from the Garden Party Planning Committee, with Lady Thornberry stating in writing that certain individuals lack the refinement necessary for such delicate tasks." He looked up, his eyes finding Lady Thornberry's increasingly pale face. "Would you like me to continue? I have 3 years' worth of documentation here." The silence in the room was deafening. Several board members who had remained neutral in the conflict looked horrified at the revelations. Mrs. Whitfield, an elderly member who had always been kind to Catherine, spoke up with quiet dignity. "I had no idea it had gone this far. This is shameful." William nodded to her gratefully before turning his attention back to the main culprits. "But documentation of petty cruelties isn't why I'm standing here today. I'm here to tell you all a story about real nobility, the kind that has nothing to do with bloodlines or titles." He began to pace, his voice taking on a different quality, filled with pride and love. "Catherine Middleton grew up in a house filled with love, hard work, and values that seem to have been forgotten in certain circles. Her parents built their business from nothing, working 18-hour days to provide for their children. They taught their daughter that worth comes from character, not from inheritance. When Catherine met me at university, she had no idea who I was for the first several weeks. When she found out, she tried to distance herself, not because she felt unworthy, but because she didn't want to be seen as someone trying to advance herself through association. I had to convince her to give me a chance." William's voice softened as he looked at Catherine, whose eyes had filled with tears. "In the years since, I've watched her handle scrutiny that would break most people. She's been photographed, analyzed, criticized, and judged every single day. Her family has been mocked. Her mother particularly targeted for the crime of being proud of her daughter. And through it all, Catherine has maintained a grace and dignity that puts every single one of her critics to shame." He turned back to face the board, his voice hardening again. While you've been whispering in corners about bloodlines and breeding, Catherine has been working. She's developed comprehensive programs for early childhood development. She's spent countless hours with disadvantaged youth, not for photo opportunities, but because she genuinely cares. She's modernized our approach to mental health initiatives, bringing in experts and evidence-based practices that have already helped thousands. But more than that, William's voice rose, filled with passion. She's shown me what real strength looks like. Do you know what she said to me last week when Lady Thornberry's latest planted story appeared in the press? She said, "They must be very unhappy people to spend so much time trying to hurt others. I feel sorry for them." He laughed bitterly. She feels sorry for you. After everything you've put her through, she has the compassion to pity the smallness of your lives. That, ladies and gentlemen, is true nobility. Lord Pemberton, his face red with indignation, attempted to speak. "Your Highness, you cannot simply come in here and make wild accusations." Wild accusations? William's voice became dangerously quiet. "Lord Pemberton, would you like me to read the email you sent to your club members about ensuring the Middleton woman knows her place? Or perhaps Lady Thornberry would prefer I share the recording of her phone conversation with the Duchess of Marlborough, where she outlined her plan to make Catherine so miserable she would leave me." The blood drained from both their faces. Lady Thornberry's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. You recorded private conversations?" "I didn't have to," William replied coldly. "Amazing how many people you thought were your allies were actually disgusted by your behavior. They came to me, horrified by what they were witnessing. Did you really think everyone in your social circle shared your poisonous views?" He pulled out another document. "This is a letter signed by 43 members of various royal patronages and charities. They're calling for new leadership on this board, citing concerns about the toxic environment certain members have created. The palace has received over 200 complaints about the treatment Catherine has received at official functions. 200, from people brave enough to speak up against the established order." William moved to stand behind Catherine's chair, his hands resting protectively on her shoulders. "But here's what you've never understood, and what makes your campaign so spectacularly stupid. You thought you were protecting the monarchy from dilution, preserving some mythical pure bloodline. In reality, you were trying to destroy the very thing that will save it." His voice became impassioned. "The monarchy survives not because of ancient bloodlines or dusty traditions, but because it adapts. It survives because it finds ways to remain relevant and connected to the people it serves. Catherine represents that evolution. She understands ordinary people because she was one of them. She knows what it's like to worry about bills, to work for a living, to build something from nothing. That's not a weakness. It's the greatest strength she could bring to this institution. While you've been clinging to your titles and your inherited prejudices, the world has moved on. The people don't want distant, untouchable royals anymore. They want leaders who understand their struggles, who can speak to their experiences. Catherine gives us that connection, and you've been too blinded by snobbery to see it." William pulled out one final document. "This is a directive from the Queen herself. Effective immediately, there will be a complete restructuring of this board. Lady Thornberry, Lord Pemberton, your resignations are expected by end of business today. If they're not received, you'll be removed formally and the reasons will be made public." Gasps echoed around the room. The Queen's intervention was the ultimate authority, and everyone knew there was no appeal from her decision. "Furthermore," William continued, "Catherine will be taking on an expanded role in the Foundation's strategic planning. Her initiatives have shown more innovation and impact in 2 years than this board has managed in the last decade. It's time we started listening to fresh voices instead of silencing them." Lady Thornberry found her voice, though it trembled. "You can't do this. We have supporters, influence." "You had influence," William corrected, past tense. Do you really think your whisper campaigns and society connections mean anything compared to the full weight of the Crown's displeasure? You've forgotten the first rule of palace politics. Never mistake proximity for power. The boardroom had become a battlefield of silence after William's devastating pronouncements. Lady Thornbury sat frozen in her chair, her carefully constructed world of privilege and prejudice crumbling around her. Lord Pemberton's face had gone from red to a sickly gray, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The other board members seemed caught between shock and a strange sense of relief, as if a poison that had infected their ranks was finally being expelled. Catherine stood slowly, her natural grace evident even in this moment of high tension. She placed a gentle hand on William's arm, and something in her touch seemed to calm the storm of his fury. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying none of the hesitation that had marked her early days in these circles. "I would like to say something," she began, and every eye in the room turned to her. For so long, she had been the silent target of their attacks, bearing their cruelty with dignified silence. Now, for the first time, she would speak her truth. "Lady Thornbury, Lord Pemberton, and those who have supported your campaign against me, I want you to know that I forgive you." The words seemed to physically impact her tormentors, who had expected anger, not absolution. "I forgive you because holding on to bitterness would only diminish me, and I refuse to let your smallness make me smaller." She moved away from William, walking slowly around the table as she spoke. "You've spent 3 years trying to break me, to make me run away, to prove that I don't belong here. In a way, I should thank you. Your cruelty taught me strength I didn't know I possessed. Your exclusion showed me who my real friends are. Your attempts to humiliate me only highlighted the superficiality of the world you're so desperate to protect." Catherine stopped in front of a portrait of a long-dead royal patron that hung on the wall. "Do you know what this man was known for? Not his bloodline or his titles, but for establishing hospitals for the poor. He scandalized society by visiting slums and touching diseased patients with his bare hands. The aristocracy of his time called him a traitor to his class. History calls him a visionary." She turned back to face the room. "The institution you claim to be protecting doesn't need protection from people like me. It needs protection from people like you, those who would freeze it in amber, making it a museum piece rather than a living, breathing force for good in the world." Mrs. Whitfield began to clap slowly, and soon others joined her. The applause seemed to break something in Lady Thornbury, who suddenly looked every one of her 70 years. "You don't understand," Lady Thornbury said weakly. "We were trying to preserve something precious, something that's been built over centuries." "Built on what?" William interjected sharply. "On the exclusion of good people? On the perpetuation of meaningless hierarchies? On cruelty disguised as tradition? If that's what we're preserving, then it deserves to die." He moved to the head of the table, assuming natural command of the room. "Let me be crystal clear about what happens next. This board will be reconstituted with members who understand that our mission is to serve the people, not to maintain some fantasy of aristocratic purity. Every charity and organization under royal patronage will be reviewed for similar toxic behaviors. And anyone who attempts to undermine or attack Catherine again will face immediate and severe consequences." "You're making a mistake," Lord Pemberton managed to croak out. "The established families, the traditional supporters of the monarchy, will adapt or be left behind," William finished for him. "Do you think the factory worker in Birmingham cares about your ancient bloodline? Does the single mother in Glasgow take comfort in your 500-year-old family tree? The monarchy's strength comes from its connection to all the people, not just the privileged few who happen to share your prejudices." A knock at the door interrupted the tension. William's private secretary entered, followed by several other figures. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a young entrepreneur who had built a technology empire from nothing, and Dr. Sarah Chen, a renowned child psychologist whose innovative approaches had revolutionized early childhood education. Both had been personally selected by Catherine for the board. "Ah," William said with satisfaction. "Perfect timing. Allow me to introduce some of the new board members. People chosen not for their family names or inherited wealth, but for their achievements, their innovation, and their genuine commitment to making a difference." Lady Thornberry gathered what remained of her dignity and stood. "I suppose you expect me to make a scene, to rage against this injustice." She looked directly at Catherine. "But I won't give you that satisfaction. I'll submit my resignation within the hour." As she moved toward the door, Catherine called out, "Lady Thornberry." The older woman paused but didn't turn around. "I hope someday you'll understand that there was room for both of us here. It was you who chose to make it a battle." Lady Thornberry's shoulders stiffened, but she left without another word. Lord Pemberton followed quickly, muttering about consulting his solicitors. A few others, clearly aligned with the old guard, also made their exits, but the majority remained, some looking relieved, others energized by the promise of real change. As the new board members took their seats, Mrs. Whitfield stood. "Your Royal Highness, I believe I speak for many of us when I say that what happened here today was long overdue. We've been cowards allowing this behavior to continue because it was easier than confronting it. For that, I personally apologize to you, Catherine." One by one, other board members offered their apologies and support. Catherine accepted them with grace, though William noted the wariness in her eyes. Trust, once broken, would take time to rebuild. The rest of the meeting proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Without the toxic presence of the old guard, ideas flowed freely. Catherine's proposals for expanding mental health services to underserved communities were not only approved but expanded upon. The new board members brought fresh perspectives and innovative approaches that had been stifled for years under the previous regime. As the meeting concluded, William watched Catherine interact with the new members, saw how her natural warmth and intelligence shone when she wasn't constantly defending herself against attacks. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, confident, compassionate, and brilliant. Later, as they walked back through the palace corridors, Catherine was quiet. William knew her well enough to recognize she was processing everything that had happened. "Are you angry with me?" he asked finally. "For making such a scene?" She stopped walking and turned to face him, her brown eyes searching his face. "Angry? William, no, She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I'm overwhelmed. No one has ever defended me like that. No one has ever fought for me with such ferocity." "I would do it again in a heartbeat," William said firmly. "I should have done it sooner. I kept thinking if I just ignored them, they would eventually accept you. I was a fool." Catherine shook her head. "You were trying to keep the peace. I understand that. But William, what you did today, it wasn't just about defending me. You drew a line in the sand about what kind of monarchy we're going to have, what kind of future we're building. That took incredible courage." They resumed walking, hand in hand now. "There will be fallout," William warned. "Lady Thornberry and her allies won't go quietly. They'll try to spin this in the press, rally their supporters." "Let them," Catherine interrupted with a steel in her voice that would have surprised those who only saw her public persona. "I'm done being afraid of their opinions. Today showed me something important. There are more people ready for change than those clinging to the past. We just needed someone brave enough to stand up and say, 'Enough.'" As they reached their private apartments, William pulled her close. "You know what the irony is? They spent all this time trying to prove you weren't worthy of being royal. But today you showed more genuine royalty than any of them have in their entire lives. The ability to forgive those who wronged you, to transform pain into purpose, to lead with compassion rather than control, that's what real nobility looks like. Catherine smiled. A real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "We make a good team, don't we?" "The best," William agreed. "And this is just the beginning. The changes we started today, they're going to ripple out. Every institution, every charity, every aspect of royal life that's been frozen in the past is going to be examined and, if necessary, transformed." Over the following weeks, the palace earthquake that William had triggered continued to reverberate. Lady Thornberry's attempts to rally support in the media backfired spectacularly when several prominent journalists revealed their own stories of witnessing her cruel behavior toward Catherine. Lord Pemberton quietly retreated to his country estate, his influence evaporating overnight. More importantly, the changes to the board sparked a wider revolution within royal circles. Other charities and organizations began examining their own practices, rooting out the toxic elements that had been allowed to fester for too long. Young, dynamic leaders were brought in, bringing fresh ideas and inclusive approaches that had been desperately needed. Catherine threw herself into her expanded role with renewed energy. Free from constant attacks, she was able to focus on what really mattered, making a difference in people's lives. Her early childhood development programs became models for organizations around the world. Her mental health initiatives broke down barriers and stigma that had persisted for generations. William watched with pride as his wife flourished, becoming not just a beloved public figure, but a genuinely transformative force within the institution. The girl from Bucklebury, who had once been dismissed as unsuitable, had become the very embodiment of what modern royalty could and should be. Years later, when historians looked back on this period, they would mark that boardroom confrontation as a turning point, the moment when the British monarchy chose progress over prejudice, inclusion over exclusion, and love over bloodlines. It was the day Prince William showed that protecting those we love isn't just a personal duty, but sometimes a revolutionary act. But for William and Catherine, walking hand in hand through their palace home that evening, it was simpler than that. It was the day they stopped letting others define their worth and started building the future they wanted to see, together, unashamed and unafraid. The portraits of long-dead aristocrats looked down from the walls as they passed, but their disapproving faces held no power anymore. The future belonged to those brave enough to change, strong enough to forgive, and wise enough to know that true nobility has nothing to do with the blood in your veins and everything to do with the love in your heart.